Friends, last week we enjoyed a baptism here in our church, and we spoke a lot about our second call in life. We talked a lot about how our first call has to do with the life that we are just naturally born into, and how our second call has to do with the way in which we are called to adventure. In our tradition, we would say it's God's call of discipleship, God's call of loving and serving neighbor. And so it's important to remember the context in which we hear the words that we're about to hear today. Jesus heard the call. He heard God say, "You are my beloved, with whom I am well pleased." And the first thing Jesus did after coming to terms with what that meant was go out and find some fishermen and say, "You are not just fishermen, you are God's beloved, and you are called to other things." And the very next thing that they all did together was go up on a mountain and sit down. And then Jesus gave this teaching, the words I'm about to read, as the very first public sermon, the first public teaching of his ministry. This is what he felt compelled to say first. So from the book of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, the disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons and daughters of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so men persecuted the prophets who were before you." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. A few months ago, many of you had the opportunity to meet one of my dearest friends in life, Josh. Josh came here and he preached at the installation service that we all enjoyed back in October. Josh and I have known each other for more than 20 years. We met at a summer church camp. And as adults, when we both felt called to ordained ministry, we began looking at seminaries. And he and I have always shared the conviction that seminary should not be like other graduate school programs. It should be more like the Jedi Academy in Star Wars. We've always been very convinced that we have our entire lives to read all the big books and do all the academic struggling and to have all the theological debates, all the things that are very essential for doing good ministry. We've been convinced that we have our entire lives to engage those works, and seminary should be a place where you are actually able to encounter God, to get your hands dirty, to start experiencing God in the world and figure out how God is calling us to be, to grab a lightsaber and use the Force, or actually in our theological understanding, to allow the Force to use us. We were convinced this should be true. So he and I both, we went to different schools, but we both found ways of making seminary an experience, something that we really lived into and learned from, to balance out all the academic work that we were called to do as well. And for me, my most formational experience in that training was the year that I became a barista at Starbucks in Newton Center, Massachusetts. It's true. For 3 years in seminary, we had heard over and over again that the church has certain struggles and church leadership is looking different than it has in the past. And for 3 years, we would hear the same dire, big questions that couldn't be answered. Fewer people are coming through our doors. What are we going to do? More and more people feel that the work of the church is irrelevant or disingenuous or ineffective. Ministers especially are seen as being out of touch with normal people's lives. They're seen as people who can't possibly understand what it is to be a normal person living in this world. I was tired of feeling like I'm on the outside, that I had to always be told, expect the world to see you as a weirdo. I wanted to see what life was like for normal people. So I became a barista at Starbucks in Newton Center, Massachusetts. This is a group of folks who are among the busiest, among the most stressed, the highest paid, most high in demand folks in the entire country. And for a year, I experienced trading caffeine and sugar in various forms in exchange for money. And by the end of that year, I realized that while I had set out to learn more about them out there, what it really taught me was more about me. Because for a year, standing behind the cash register, exchanging goods and services, interacting with customers I liked, trying to avoid customers I didn't like, getting yelled at for making coffee poorly, getting praised and told that this is the best part of my day simply for pouring a cup of coffee, all of it matched my experience in the world. I wasn't learning about people who were so very different than me, who were unaware of God's actions in their lives. I was learning about myself. And I was learning about how I had been oblivious to God acting in my life. What I learned first and foremost is this. I was born in the later part of the 20th century in America. And because that's true, I was raised from a very early age in the practice of buying and selling. My first call in life is to be a consumer. You know, you have to be 18 years old before you can vote and be a citizen. You have to be in your teens at least to start being aware of any kind of call, any kind of vocation. But since long before I can actually remember, I was practicing buying and selling, trying to get the best deals I could for as little as possible. Whether it was complaining to my mom that I wanted that thing on TV, or learning how to count my nickels and dimes and then talk the guy at the store into giving me something for cheaper. That is the first experience I practiced. That was the first identity I started to cultivate for myself, a consumer. And it's important to name that. It's important to know what your first call is, so that when you start hearing God's call, when you start hearing God say, you are beloved and everyone is blessed, you can start asking different questions. Human beings are creatures of habit, and so the things that we do over and over and over again have a real effect on who we are and how we live our lives. I may pride myself today on being a spiritual leader and teacher, and I have certain spiritual practices that help me do that. I spend a good amount of time each week in prayer and reading and reflecting and writing. But I can show you on my calendar the number of times each week that I do those things. Any week that I try to keep track of the transactions where I am actively buying and selling or thinking about buying and selling, guys, every time I try to keep track, I lose it by Monday. It's out the door. There's too many instances of it. So if humans are creatures of habit, then what we practice, what we choose to do, and how we choose to act in our lives shapes us into who we become. And if you hear the second call, if you hear God calling you beloved and blessed, it becomes very important to figure out how to practice belovedness with the same tenacity that we practice consuming. Jesus himself was born not understanding himself to be God's beloved, but just seeing himself as an Israelite in a Roman-occupied country. His first lens wouldn't have been so much consuming as much as avoiding trouble with the Roman Empire and doing whatever he could to not be killed by them and to benefit them as much as was possible. But then he gets dunked under the water, and he hears God call him, "My beloved, with whom I am well pleased." And suddenly he has more concerns than just serving the empire and preserving his own life. And he goes out and he calls to other people, and he says, "Hey, you, fishermen, you're not valued by your job. Don't let the world convince you that you are only worth what you do for a living. Follow me, and you will be fish for people, because you are blessed, you are beloved." And then when they gather together on this mountain, the very first thing he teaches his followers, the very first thing he says to crowds of people who haven't even heard the call yet, "You are blessed." Don't be fooled by what the world tells you. If the world calls you poor, know that God calls you blessed. If the world causes you to mourn and anguish, know that God comforts you. If the world sees you as merciful, know that God will help you obtain mercy. If the world sees you as hungry and thirsty for righteousness, as an enemy of injustice, know that God will satisfy you. Every day of our lives, in countless ways, we are taught how to buy and sell. And if that's the lens we keep seeing the world through, then that's all we know how to do. If it's all we practice, then it's all we are. But if we hear God's call, "You are beloved," if we hear God's call, "Even the useless are blessed, even the outcast are blessed," the people that the world doesn't know what to do with are blessed, then we start thinking about what it is we're called to do. Have you heard the call? Are you aware of your belovedness? I'm not kidding. Every day we get advertisements and we get big bulletin boards and signs telling us what to buy and what to expect and how to sell and what to value and to find the best possible transaction we can for ourselves. So now I ask you, in this moment, for a brief moment, hear these words. You are beloved. You are blessed. How can you practice that belovedness? Every day of our lives, we are caught up in this buying and selling practice, and it's a practice that encourages us to seek the maximum benefit at the lowest cost. It's what the world does, it's what the world cares about. And when we clearly hear Jesus' call declaring that we are blessed beyond measure, beloved in abundance, we start to have other concerns than simply buying and selling. We begin to see and hear new questions, new concerns. There is a national debate about health care, and it's a debate that focuses intently on the cost of health insurance. But it gives no mention to the value of the blessed people who are seeking health care. We begin to hear a national debate about immigration that focuses exclusively on the cost of immigration and the costs of mitigating the problems with it, while it leaves out completely the value of God's beloved who are in search of a safe haven. Here in our hometown, we face these same issues. We put buying and selling values ahead of human values. The property taxes around here and the cost of living is going up exponentially to the point where people who have lived here for generations, not to mention folks who would like to live here and can't, they're finding it impossible to afford to live here. And so our neighborhoods are suffering. Friends, what does it mean for us as a church to sit in this space and declare that all people are blessed and to know that our property values are being given a higher value than potential new neighbors, than a potential new community? I don't ask these questions because I have answers. I ask these questions because Jesus compels us to hear the call. You are beloved, and everyone is blessed. How will you practice your blessedness? The world can't stop buying and selling, and it shouldn't. That's what the world is for. Those of us who have heard God call us beloved, for those of us who have heard Jesus declare the blessedness of every human, no matter how insignificant to the world, we begin to have other concerns. We begin to see what we must practice. We have to practice our belovedness with the same tenacity and frequency that we practice our consumerism, our buying and selling. As the world tries to convince us that everything has a price and you should be more concerned about getting the best you can while giving the least you can, those who have heard the call need to practice saying, you are blessed. Now go and be a blessing to others. This is the call. This is the adventure. Don't let the world fool you, beloved. You are not valued by what you can do for the market or what use you are to the world. You are valued beyond measure as God's blessed children. And you are called to practice blessing others, no matter the cost.